President Trump is threatening to close the southern border if Democrats do not approve a plan to fund his border wall. In a tweet Friday, the president said, quote, "We will be forced to close the southern border entirely if the obstructionist Democrats do not give us the money to finish the wall and also change the ridiculous immigration laws that our country is saddled with." CBS News estimates closing the border could cost $1 billion a day. This comes as his stalemate with Democrats over government funding continues. The president has said he will not sign a plan to end the partial government shutdown without $5 billion in funding for a border wall. But on CBS This Morning on Friday, White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders indicated the president might be willing to negotiate on that amount.
We've heard a lot of mixed numbers that the president is willing to come down to $2 billion, maybe a little lower. Can you give us any idea what the president would be willing to accept financially for border security, for his border wall, where we could reach a deal if Democrats would get there?
Look, we've made that clear to the Democrats. I'm not going to negotiate in the press, but the president has been willing to negotiate on this point, and the Democrats have not been willing to do anything. And that's the sad part. They care more about keeping our borders open than keeping our government open.
And joining me now from Washington is Niall Stanage. He's a White House columnist for The Hill. Welcome, Niall. Great to see you. So what more is the White House saying about how much they are willing to negotiate with Democrats?
Wall is, right? The president has made a number of remarks recently implying that he would be willing to countenance some form of border fencing. Very beautiful steel slats was another example of another version of the wall that he would be willing to accept. So on the one hand, we have that sort of looseness about the definition of a wall. And then on the other hand, as the clip you just played from Sarah Sanders indicated, some suggestion that the White House is certainly willing to come down to some degree from its initial $5 billion demand.
And Niall, we mentioned the president's tweet about shutting down the entire southern border if Democrats do not fund the border wall. Is this something that he can even legally do? Is this something he might actually try to follow through on? And what are some of the political risks in doing so?
Well, for a start, in practical terms, it's very, very difficult. You mentioned in your introduction, Tanya, the amount of trade, about $1 billion a day that crosses that border. Around 1 million people legally cross that border each day. So the idea of closing it down on a practical sense makes, I think, not a whole lot of sense. Politically, there's the danger of a self-inflicted injury if you were to try to seal the border, precisely for the reasons that I have just spoken about. The United States would, in effect, be disrupting that trade, disrupting that movement of people legally passing between the two jurisdictions. So in that respect, it seems a threat that would, in fact, blow up in the president's face were he to try to execute it.
I can't imagine having a U.S. citizen standing at the border saying, you know, I need to come home and not allowing that person to cross the border. It just doesn't seem to make much sense. But the likely next Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, has said House Democrats will vote to reopen the government on January 3rd. Do we know anything about the plans Democrats are working on?
Publicly, they haven't said a whole lot, but one possibility is that the Democrats in the House could decide to pass legislation very similar, if not identical, to the stopgap measure that the Senate passed a short time ago. The rationale for doing that would be that that legislation would then have to go back to the Republican majority Senate, and Republican senators would then have to decide either whether they would oppose a measure that they had supported only a couple of weeks before, or whether they would back that measure and therefore break with the president. From a tactical perspective, that seems like an obvious move that Nancy Pelosi could make once Democrats take control of the House.
And so, Niall, is this fighting that we're seeing with the government shutdown a preview, then, of what's to come between the White House and Democrats in 2019?
Probably, because in the current environment, neither side has a whole lot of incentive to compromise. You know, we talk until we're blue in the face about how polarised the nation has become. But one effect of that is that for both Democrats and for the White House, their strategy is essentially appealing to their own base. On both sides, that base detests the people on the opposite side. So therefore, the incentive to come together or to find some common ground isn't there on most issues. There are a couple of small exceptions, things like infrastructure spending. But for the most part, I think you'll be seeing Democrats and the president define themselves in contrast to one another.
Boy, if both sides really dig in their heels, not a lot's going to get done next year in Congress. And what about President Trump and Senate Republicans? Are things going to become more difficult between the president and Senate Republicans next year?
Well, that's a great question because, as I mentioned in relation to the stopgap spending measure, that was something that Republicans in the Senate passed and then were pretty horrified to find that President Trump wasn't going to sign it after all. So that is one example of a kind of dysfunction that is there within that relationship. Now, previously, the cracks have been papered over, partly out of just a general sense of party loyalty and also because there has been a strong economy and things like that tend to hold parties together. If the president's approval ratings begin to fall further or if the economy gets into choppier waters, we could then see Republican senators perhaps distancing themselves from the president a little bit more. That isn't the sort of thing that one imagines the president reacting terribly well to. So your question is well taken. Those tensions could definitely increase.
It's interesting because you often see the president sort of acts in his own best interests and not often in the best interests of the Senate. But you have yet to see the Senate, or Senate Republicans rather, really divorcing themselves from the president, at least thus far.
Yes, because thus far they have seen their political interests being towing the line, being as loyal to him as possible. But, you know, that gets to the point we were just talking about. If the economy goes south, if the president's overall approval ratings decline further, if Robert Mueller, who we haven't mentioned till now, if he comes back with findings that are seen as especially damning, then all of that can affect that relationship.
And it's great that you bring up Robert Mueller. Do you think that he's waiting until the new year to come forward with some new indictments?
You know, a lot of people would have lost money guessing when Robert Mueller is about to make his final report at this stage. It's difficult to assess. There do seem to be some indicators that he's moving toward the final phase, but guessing Robert Mueller's next move is always a risky business.
Yes, but something we cannot resist trying to do.
For sure.
All right, Niall. And finally, in the new year, we will see more Democrats announce their presidential campaigns. Who are you watching in particular?
Well, it could be, if not a cast of thousands, certainly a pretty large field for the Democratic nomination. Clearly, Beto O'Rourke is someone who has captured Liberal imagination a great deal since his unsuccessful run for a Senate seat in Texas. I do think, though, that some people, like Elizabeth Warren, for example, the senator from Massachusetts, are still frontline candidates and are being somewhat overlooked because Mr. O'Rourke's the flavour of the month. So Beto O'Rourke, Elizabeth Warren, Senator Kamala Harris in California is another potentially strong candidate. And I also wouldn't write off Bernie Sanders, the independent from Vermont, who, of course, made a strong run, a stronger run than many people were expecting at Hillary Clinton last time around.
Certainly will be an interesting field for sure. Niall Stanage, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.